Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Miss Marple Whispers Behind Closed Doors, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Miss Marple. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Last Bell at Evensong. A quiet Sunday in Little Witchford ends with the distant toll of church bells and a scream that shatters the stillness. It was the sort of Sunday that might have been painted in watercolor, a haze of early autumn mist curling softly along the hedgerows, the faint hum of bees lingering about the last of the late roses, and the quiet clip of polished shoes on flagstone as the good parishioners of St. Aldhelm's Church filed out from Evensong. The bells had just finished their final toll, solemn and sonorous, when the scream came, high and thin, like the cry of a bird dashed against a window pane. It startled the rooks in the elms and sent Mrs. Calthorpe's Pekingese muffin into a yapping frenzy. Miss Jane Marple, walking at a modest pace along the green, her gloved hands folded neatly around her prayer book, stopped quite still. "Good heavens," murmured the vicar's wife, clutching at her pearls. What on earth was that? No one moved for a moment. Then young Tommy Brent, the curate with more energy than sense, was off at a trot toward the direction of the scream, toward Gossamer Lane and the footpath that led behind Greystone Manor. Others followed more cautiously. Mr. Purvis, the grocer, wiping his hands on his apron, old Colonel Weatherby muttering something about young women and motorbikes, and Miss Marple herself, who said nothing but narrowed her blue eyes slightly and quickened her step with quiet determination. The path to Greystone Manor ran past the old orchard, now half wild with crabapples and nettles. It was there they found her, Miss Lettice Blackwood, youngest daughter of the formidable Lady Theodosia Blackwood, lying half-sprawled at the edge of the orchard fence, her bonnet torn and one white-gloved hand frozen in an odd, reaching gesture. Her eyes were wide, unseeing. Her throat had been quite cleanly slit. There was a collective gasp. Mrs. Calthorpe fainted quietly into the hedgerow. Miss Marple, who had not moved from her spot, observed the body with what might best be described as restrained sorrow, and an unmistakable glint of curiosity. By the time Constable Rowntree arrived on his bicycle, puffing and pink in the face, a crowd had formed, albeit the kind of well-behaved, whispering crowd only an English village could produce. He cleared his throat and attempted a firm tone. "No one touch anything, if you please. No one leave the area until I've spoken to you." A few villagers nodded gravely. Mrs. Jeffers, from the bakery, whispered something to her husband and clutched his arm. Mr. Jonathan Blackwood, Lettice's elder brother, had been summoned from the house and now stood stiffly nearby, his expression unreadable beneath a thick moustache. Miss Marple, still standing a little apart, turned to Mrs. Banbury of the Women's Institute, her voice low and mild. "I always thought it would be poor Lettice," she said gently. "Such a sensitive girl. And always watching people. Too closely, perhaps." "Do you think it's murder?" Mrs. Banbury asked, eyes wide. Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Oh, yes. And quite deliberate, I should think." The parlour at Greystone Manor smelled faintly of beeswax, lavender, and restrained disapproval. Lady Theodosia Blackwood sat ramrod straight in her brocade armchair, lips pressed into a line that might have been mistaken for grief by someone less acquainted with her temperament. "She was never quite suited to the country," she said crisply, "always reading dreadful modern novels and asking inappropriate questions." The inspector, a stout, careful man named Inspector Graves from Melchester, took notes with practiced discretion. "And had she, to your knowledge, any disagreements with anyone in the household? Servants, family, visitors?" Lady Theodosia sniffed. "The servants are loyal, the family is respectable, and we've had no guests since the garden party last Thursday. Lettuce could be impulsive, imaginative, but she wasn't foolish." Miss Marple, who had been quietly seated near the window under the pretext of offering comfort, observed the exchange with the polite attentiveness of one who appeared to be thinking about lace patterns, but was, in fact, considering the nuances of human nature. "Forgive me, Lady Theodosia," she said at last, "but did Lettuce ever confide in you about, well, her fears or suspicions?" Lady Theodosia pursed her lips. "Certainly not. I don't encourage that sort of thing." Miss Marple nodded, as if this were the most natural response in the world. By the following morning, speculation had overtaken every corner of Little Witchful. At the Rose and Willow tea rooms, Mrs. Maplethorpe and Miss Grimsley were deep in discussion over toasted tea cakes. "I heard she was involved with that American," said Miss Grimsley, eyes glittering. "Nonsense," said Mrs. Maplethorpe. "He's a widower and quite respectable. I think it was young Dr. Linton. You know what they say about doctors, so many opportunities." Meanwhile, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the village library, where she examined the borrowing ledger and asked a few gentle questions of the librarian, who obligingly remembered which novels Lettuce had been interested in, several of which involved poisons, hidden wills, and a suspicious number of mysterious aunts. Later, on her walk home, Miss Marple paused near the orchard and knelt to examine something half buried in the soft earth. A button, large, horn, and rather military-looking, not at all feminine. She tucked it into her reticule with a nod. That evening, as twilight deepened and the gas lamps flickered to life, Miss Marple sat by her fireside, knitting on her lap and a thoughtful frown upon her face. "People so often think murder is about passion," she murmured to herself. "But more often than not, it's about fear. Fear of being exposed. Fear of losing something. Status, money, secrets." She glanced down at her knitting, and poor Lettuce was always asking the wrong questions to the wrong people. Outside, the bells of St. Aldhelm's began to toll again, the same measured chime that had marked the end of evensong the evening before. This time they tolled over a village no longer quite so quiet, and a murder no longer quite so baffling. Miss Marple smiled, just slightly. "It always begins with a whisper," she said softly, "but the truth always finds a way to speak." Chapter 2. Tea for 3, not 4. In the village tea room, cups clink and glances linger. One guest never arrived, and no one dares to ask why. The Rose and Willow tea room sat gently at the corner of the green in Little Witchford, its ivy-draped windows hazy with condensation from the warmth within. Inside, it smelled of warm scones, rose-petal jam, and just a whisper of gossip. The lace curtains, starched, white, and delicately embroidered, filtered the late afternoon light to a gentle glow, while mismatched porcelain teacups clinked faintly against saucers as they were set down on polished walnut tables. It was 4:30, the usual hour for the Thursday gathering. Miss Felicity Arkwright was already seated by the window, Her pale gloves laid neatly atop her handbag, her back impeccably straight. Beside her sat Mrs. Honoria Finch, a woman with a taste for lace and a talent for genteel judgment, stirring her tea as if it might reveal a scandal, if agitated enough. Across from them, a third chair sat empty, its napkin untouched, the teacup beside it still gleaming and bone-dry. They had expected Lettice Blackwood. No one said her name aloud. Instead, they spoke of weather and dahlias and the scarcity of good seamstresses. Yet their eyes, watchful, alert, flickered toward the door with every jingle of the bell until the fourth place at the table became a silent indictment, a pale ghost of expectation. Miss Marple, seated not far off, quietly observed them over her slice of seed cake. She had chosen her usual seat in the corner, the one with a view of both the door and the street beyond. She sipped her tea, black with lemon, and made no move to intrude, though her ears, as always, were uncommonly attentive. Mrs. Finch was the first to breach the veil of propriety. "It is dreadfully tragic," she murmured, dabbing at the corner of her mouth with her napkin. "So young." Miss Arkwright nodded solemnly, "and so impulsive. But one mustn't speak ill." "Of course not," Mrs. Finch replied, her tone thick with implication. "But still, wandering alone behind the orchard after dusk, and so soon after that silly quarrel with her brother." "Quarrel?" Miss Arkwright blinked. "I hadn't heard." Mrs. Finch pressed her lips together. "Oh, I may have spoken out of turn." Miss Marple turned a page in her needlework magazine without looking up. The conversation continued in measured tones, cloaked in civility but sharpened with purpose. Miss Marple noted, with the instinctive precision of a seasoned observer, that neither woman once acknowledged the empty chair beside them. They each filled their cups, nibbled at their biscuits, and adjusted the napkins on their laps as though it had never existed. But it had. Miss Marple remembered quite clearly the conversation overheard at the post office the day before, when Lettice had mentioned joining the ladies for tea, that she had news to share. "She'll never have the chance now," Miss Marple murmured softly to herself. At that moment, the door swung open, and in stepped Dr. Linton, tall, composed, his spectacles catching the light. He removed his hat and greeted the room with a courteous nod, though a furrow lingered between his brows. He approached Miss Marple with a look that suggested discomfort in equal measure with obligation. "Miss Marple," he said, "I'd hoped I might find you here." "Of course, dear Dr. Linton. Sit down. Do have some tea. Rosehip today, I believe." He declined the tea, but lowered himself into the seat opposite her with an expression of grave courtesy. "The coroner's report confirms what we suspected," he said quietly. "The wound was made with a small, sharp blade, likely a surgical knife or stiletto. Clean, deep, expertly placed." Miss Marple nodded, unflinching. "And no sign of a struggle?" "None." "I see." She took a slow sip of tea. "And who, pray, would be likely to carry such an instrument? Aside from yourself, of course, which I don't for a moment suspect." Dr. Linton gave a dry smile. "It's a small village, Miss Marple. I dare say there are no more than a handful of people who might possess such a tool, though motive is the greater puzzle." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, not always. Motive is often very ordinary indeed. Pride, fear, money, reputation, and of course, secrets." Dr. Linton's gaze flickered briefly to the table, where Mrs. Finch and Miss Arkwright sat. "I suppose you've heard the latest whispers." "I rarely rely on whispers," said Miss Marple, "but I often find them remarkably informative." Dr. Linton stood. "If you learn anything, I trust you'll let me know." Miss Marple smiled primly. "Naturally." After he had gone, she finished her tea and rose, placing her gloves gently in her handbag. On her way out, she passed the table of the two women, who both looked up with the sudden brittle smiles reserved for acquaintances of uncertain intimacy. "Ladies," Miss Marple greeted them. "Such a dreadful thing," murmured Miss Arkwright. "We can hardly believe it." "I'm sure you can't," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I dare say she might have said something had she arrived, something quite inconvenient." Mrs. Finch coloured slightly. "Really, Miss Marple, what are you suggesting?" "Oh, nothing," Miss Marple said sweetly. "Only that 4 was intended, and 3 came instead. And in my experience, when someone is silenced before they can speak, one must ask not only who stood to gain, but who sat waiting." She offered a pleasant nod and stepped out into the golden afternoon, where the shadows were already beginning to stretch long across the cobbled street. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple placed her gloves carefully on the hall table and sat by the window, watching the chimney smoke curl into the sky above Little Witchford. She took out her knitting and reflected. The knife had been clean, yes, the wound deliberate, but the motive? That had been years in the making, petty rivalries, hidden liaisons, perhaps even a long-forgotten betrayal resurrected with one tea-room conversation too many. She would begin, she thought, by speaking with young Tommy Brent. The curate had been quite flustered of late, and Miss Marple had noted more than once the direction in which he glanced whenever Miss Lettice Blackwood entered the church. There was a thread to tug, and Miss Marple, with quiet resolve, intended to see where it led. After all, in villages like Little Witchford, it was never just the tea that got stirred. Chapter 3. A Note in the Conservatory. At Greystone Manor, a cryptic message lies tucked beneath the geranium pot. A message meant to be found, or hidden. The morning after the funeral was the sort of pale, mist-hung Monday that seemed to demand restraint in both voice and colour. Even the roses in the Greystone Manor garden appeared subdued, their petals tinged with the fatigue of mourning, and a fine veil of dew hung along the hedges as though nature herself had paused to reflect. Miss Marple arrived, as she always did, neither too early nor conspicuously late. She had been invited under the vague pretext of tea with Lady Theodosia, who did not like her, but who liked gossip less, and had perhaps realized that Jane Marple was one of the few people in the village unlikely to be indiscreet, even when she knew rather too much. The drawing-room was heavy with velvet and decorum. Lady Theodosia wore a gown of deep plum and carried herself with the brittle dignity of a woman who had hosted too many garden parties and buried too many secrets. She poured tea with steady hands. "I cannot say I ever encouraged Lettice to indulge in melodrama," she said, after several minutes of conversation about chrysanthemums and the War Memorial Fund. "But I do believe she meant to unsettle us, dropping little hints, playing at mystery. It was all very tiresome. Children often do that sort of thing when they wish to be heard," Miss Marple said gently, taking a slice of seed cake, "or when they believe they've stumbled upon something they shouldn't have." Lady Theodosia's eyes flickered. "You're not suggesting Lettice's death had anything to do with that absurd business about the Blackwood Trust? That's been settled for years." "Of course," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "though in my experience, very little ever stays settled." The conversation meandered on, but Miss Marple had already gleaned what she needed. The quick flutter of Lady Theodosia's fingers when the trust was mentioned. the way her voice dropped, not on her granddaughter's name, but on the word melodrama, as though mourning had less weight than impropriety. After tea, she excused herself with a request that sounded artless. "Might I see the conservatory again? Your begonias always give me such ideas for the Women's Institute Gardens scheme." Lady Theodosia hesitated, then rang for Godfrey, the under-butler, who escorted Miss Marple to the glass-paned room at the rear of the house. The conservatory was cool, fragrant with damp soil and citrus leaves. The geraniums sat in neat rows, vivid against the green tile. Miss Marple, alone at last, moved slowly along the plants, eyes gentle, hands folded behind her back. But when she came to the far corner, just where the roof slanted downward and condensation pooled, she knelt, not to admire the foliage, but to reach beneath one terracotta pot that had been ever so slightly shifted from its circular impression in the dust. There, beneath a leaf-stained saucer, was a folded piece of cream notepaper. She opened it with a kind of reverent caution. The handwriting was unmistakably lettuces, looping, deliberate, with a faint schoolgirl affectation in the capital letters. "He watches. He knows. The ledger is not safe." Miss Marple reread it twice, then once more aloud, in a whisper. She tucked the note into her handbag and stood, dusting her skirt with a practiced sweep. She did not pause to admire the begonias. Outside, she found young Godfrey waiting, as expressionless as a China spaniel, but with a faint twitch to his right eye that suggested nerves. "That's a very fine cactus by the door," she said amiably. "Yes, ma'am." "Was it Lettuce who kept the conservatory?" Godfrey hesitated. "Often, yes. She liked to move things about. Said it helped her think." Miss Marple smiled. "I rather agree with her. She left Greystone Manor with her reticule a shade heavier, and her thoughts spinning slowly, methodically, into shape. The note was a clue, yes, but it was also bait. It had not been burned or buried. It had been placed somewhere likely to be discovered, and not by chance. But who was the intended finder? A family member? A servant? The murderer? At the village post office, Miss Marple made a casual inquiry into who might have handled the estate's correspondence of late. Mrs. Truelove, who had run the post since her husband's passing, remembered that Lettuce had sent only one letter in the week before her death, addressed, curiously, to a solicitor's office in Reading, marked confidential. "And she looked nervous," Mrs. Truelove added, tapping her spectacles. "I remember thinking she'd seen a ghost." Miss Marple nodded, then made her way home, where the kettle was already beginning to hiss. In her parlor, she removed the note and read it again. "He watches. He knows. The ledger is not safe." She thought back to the family. Lady Theodosia, proud and controlling. Jonathan, the elder brother, distant and ever so correct. Miss Arkwright, always present, always deferential to Lady Theodosia, but never quite at ease. And then there was Dr. Linton, helpful, solemn, and, perhaps too quick to confirm the lack of a struggle. Miss Marple set down her cup and retrieved her knitting. The note pointed to something concrete. The ledger. That meant financial misdeed, perhaps something that Lettuce had stumbled upon and grown anxious about. But anxiety alone did not lead to murder. No, murder required someone with something to lose, someone who had watched, someone who had known, and someone who had been in the conservatory the day Lettuce died. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the silence. "Now," she murmured, "who, I wonder, is watching now?" Chapter 4. The Vicar's Unspoken Sermon. Behind his calm pulpit smile, Reverend Hale knows more than he says, and less than he should. The bells of St. Aldhelm's Church rang out with their usual dignity on Sunday morning, calling the good people of Little Witchford to worship beneath a sky that hovered between blue and grey, as though heaven itself had paused to consider the moral character of the congregation. In the fourth pew from the front, slightly to the left of the centre aisle, sat Miss Marple, her neat straw hat trimmed with a navy ribbon, gloves folded on her lap. Her posture, though unassuming, was perfectly attentive, not only to the vicar's sermon, but to the glances exchanged behind hymnals, the coughs that concealed whispers, and the subtle shift of expressions at the mention of forgiveness, judgment, or, rather pointedly, this morning, betrayal. Reverend Hale stood at the pulpit in his modest cassock, his voice warm and measured. He spoke, as he always did, with a quiet conviction that gave his words an air of solemn gravity. But today, there was something beneath the smooth cadence of his sermon, a hesitation just behind the polished prose. He avoided eye contact more than usual, particularly with the Blackwood family, Lady Theodosia sitting upright and unmoved in the front pew, her son Jonathan beside her like a carved figurehead. And so, Reverend Hale was saying, we must guard against the temptation to let secrets fester. Yes, even when they seem harmless or were meant perhaps to protect. For the truth, my dear friends, will always seek the light. Miss Marple's brow lifted ever so slightly. It was not the words that intrigued her. She had heard sermons on secrets before, but the tone just slightly strained, as though the Reverend was speaking not only to his congregation, but from his conscience. After the service, as the villagers filed out into the autumn crispness, the vicar stood beside the great oak doors to greet his parishioners. His smile was courteous, but his eyes held the same troubled flicker Miss Marple had noticed during the sermon. "Reverend Hale," she said, as she reached him, "such a thoughtful message today. Quite timely, wouldn't you say?" He gave a short laugh, not quite comfortable. "We do what we can, Miss Marple. The Lord guides the pen, as they say." "Indeed," she said, and held his gaze for a moment. Though sometimes the pen is guided by more earthly observations, his smile faltered. She did not press him. Miss Marple knew the value of patience, and made her way down the stone steps, pausing just long enough to overhear Mrs. Finch whispering to Mrs. Maplethorpe that Lettice's diary was rumoured to have gone missing. Back in her cottage, with a fresh pot of Ceylon brewing and her knitting needles clicking steadily, Miss Marple pondered what she had seen and heard. Reverend Hale was not a man given to dramatics. He did not stumble over words unless something was troubling him deeply. That he had chosen to speak on secrets so soon after Lettice Blackwood's murder was to Miss Marple's mind more than mere coincidence. And there was something else, something about his eyes during the benediction. Not guilt precisely, but fear. It was not until Tuesday that Miss Marple had the opportunity to visit the vicarage, armed with a jar of her celebrated gooseberry preserve and a question framed as a curiosity. The vicar's wife, a kind-hearted woman whose love for geraniums was only rivaled by her loyalty to her husband, welcomed her with visible relief. Miss Marple's presence, it seemed, offered the comfort of routine. Over tea in the parlour, with a coal fire crackling and the scent of lemon biscuits perfuming the air, Miss Marple turned the conversation gently toward the matter at hand. "I do hope dear Reverend Hale is sleeping well," she said. "He looked ever so worn on Sunday." The vicar's wife, whose name was Margaret, sighed as she poured another cup. "He's been quite out of sorts," she confessed, "ever since the news about poor Miss Blackwood. You know, he saw her just the day before it happened." "Did he now?" said Miss Marple, stirring her tea. She came to the vicarage unannounced, Margaret continued, quite pale and breathless. I thought it odd, really. She never spent much time with us socially. Did she speak to him at length? Margaret hesitated. Not that of it. Later, Miss Marple asked to visit the garden, and Margaret, eager to change the subject, obliged. As they strolled among the dahlias, Miss Marple noticed a small brass plaque near the gate, in memory of Edith Hale, 1919, and remembered that the vicar had once lost a younger sister in a riding accident. It made her pause. Fear and guilt often arrived hand in hand. That evening, she paid a call to Inspector Graves. The two sat in his small office at the police station, where the fire crackled with less comfort, and the tea was regrettably weak. I'm concerned about the vicar, she said, without preamble. Graves raised an eyebrow. Reverend Hale, Miss Marple nodded. I believe he knows something. Not the identity of the killer, perhaps, but something that may lead us there. And why hasn't he said anything? Because he thinks it was told to him in confidence. But I rather suspect the conversation Lettice had with him was meant as a warning, not a confession. If she believed she was in danger, the cloth may have been her last refuge. Inspector Graves leaned back, stroking his moustache. And you believe someone else knew she'd spoken to him? I believe, said Miss Marple, that Lettice may have told someone she was going to the vicarage, and that someone followed. She retrieved, from her handbag, the note she had found in the conservatory. He watches. He knows. The ledger is not safe. I think, she said softly, the vicar may know where that ledger is. Graves nodded slowly. Then perhaps it's time we asked him directly. Miss Marple shook her head. No, I think it is time we waited. Reverend Hale is not a man who responds well to pressure. But when he realizes that what he holds could save another life, or end one, he will come forward. And as the church bells tolled again in the distance, Miss Marple looked out across the village green, where curtains were drawn and lights glowed behind lace. Secrets lingered in every cottage and behind every closed door, but not forever, because in villages like Little Witchford, someone always talks, and someone always listens. Chapter 5. Rain on the Rose Walk. A sudden downpour uncovers footprints that shouldn't exist, leading straight to the scene of the crime. It had rained that morning in Little Witchford, one of those sudden, sharp downpours that swept in from nowhere, soaked everything with gleeful abandon, and departed with just enough reluctance to leave the skies threatening a repeat performance. The air was filled with that peculiar, comforting scent of wet stone, damp earth, and crushed petals. Miss Marple, who had postponed her walk to the post office for precisely such an eventuality, watched from her front window as the garden glistened with renewal. The hydrangeas drooped under the weight of their unexpected baptism, and her sparrows huddled indignantly under the eaves. But it was the Rose Walk at Greystone Manor that had borne the most telling consequence of the rain. It was late afternoon when the discovery was made. Mabel, the young maid at the manor, freckled, good-hearted, and somewhat prone to exaggeration, had gone out to check the beehives, muttering to herself about ladies' chores and silly stings. She returned breathless, eyes wide as saucers. "There's footprints, ma'am," she gasped to Mrs. Danforth, the housekeeper. Down the Rose Walk, after the rain, plain as anything, they go all the way from the yew hedge to where Miss Lettice was found. Miss Marple heard of this, as she heard of all things, within the hour. Mr. Pritchard, the retired railway inspector who now manned the counter at the post office, repeated Mabel's tale to the baker's wife, who relayed it to Mrs. Calthorpe while purchasing shortbread, who stopped by Miss Marple's cottage for a casual, breathless cup of tea and an even more casual, breathless confession of everything she'd heard. Miss Marple, with an expression of mild curiosity, thanked her kindly and said nothing more than, "How very interesting, dear." An hour later, she was walking through the gates of Greystone Manor under the pretense of returning Lady Theodosia's embroidery scissors. Though they had not been borrowed, Inspector Graves had already arrived. He stood at the far end of the Rose Walk, peering down at the narrow, straight path that led beneath arches of climbing roses, now heavy with rain. The soil, churned into soft, dark patches between the flagstones, was indeed marked, 2 sets of footprints, clear and unmistakable, leading from the side garden through a gap in the hedge, along walk, and ending where the broken geranium pot had once been, at the edge of the orchard, where Lettice Blackwood's body had been discovered. "What do you make of it, Miss Marple?" Graves asked as she approached. "Too neat to be an accident, isn't it?" Miss Marple, stooping to peer at the imprints, nodded. "Quite. That soil is heavy clay. It holds an impression beautifully. But you see here, this boot print is narrow at the toe, and these ridges, military issue, officer's regulation, I believe." Graves gave a low whistle. "Jonathan Blackwood served in the war." "As did half the men in the village," Miss Marple replied, straightening. "But only some kept their boots." Graves frowned. "You think the killer returned?" "I think someone wanted it to appear so," Miss Marple said gently. "Look again. The first set of prints is deeper, the soil more compacted. The second, lighter, cleaner, and if I'm not mistaken, laid over the first. The pattern is mirrored, Inspector." Graves stared. "You mean someone walked back in their own footprints? Or someone with smaller feet stepped inside the existing prints to give the illusion of a second man?" He gave a low, appreciative grunt. "That's devilishly clever." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, "but not clever enough." They returned to the house, where the drawing-room was already buzzing with speculation. Lady Theodosia sat erect by the hearth, her hands knotted tightly in her lap, while Jonathan stood by the drinks tray, unsmiling, as if waiting for the inquisition to begin. "Is this to become a circus?" Lady Theodosia snapped when Graves entered. "You can hardly believe there is something new to be found. Footprints? Half the county tramples through the Rose Walk on fete days." Miss Marple spoke softly. "And yet not, I believe, in officers' boots." Jonathan turned at that. "Are you suggesting I—" His voice broke off, thick with disbelief. "No one is suggesting anything just yet," Graves said carefully. "But the prints are curious." "It wasn't me," Jonathan said quietly. "I haven't worn those boots in years." Miss Marple nodded gently. "And yet someone has. May I ask, where are they now?" "In the trunk," he replied. "In the cellar, with the rest of my service things." "Then perhaps," said Miss Marple, "we might check to see whether they are damp." He stared at her a moment longer, then left without a word. Lady Theodosia bristled. "This is an outrage, an old woman's fantasy." But Miss Marple simply folded her hands. "I'm quite fond of fantasy, Lady Theodosia, but the truth has a way of slipping through, like rain beneath a rose arbor." 15 minutes later, Jonathan returned. He carried the boots in his arms. They were dry, too dry. "Dusty," he said, voice tight. "They haven't been touched in years." Graves took them silently. Miss Marple watched Jonathan, whose hands trembled slightly. "Then we must ask," she said, "who would Wish to cast suspicion in your direction, Mr. Blackwood? Lady Theodosia paled visibly. This is preposterous. Jonathan gave a short, humorless laugh. Is it? Lettice was never meant to inherit anything significant. But when she discovered that amendment to father's will, well, she said she intended to challenge the trust. Graves looked up sharply. Amendment? She found a letter in the ledger, said it proved grandfather meant for the property to go to her, not to mother. Paused. She said she had a copy. I told her not to make trouble. And now, Miss Marple said softly, we must find that copy. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resting in her lap, her thoughts like a jigsaw slowly coming together. Someone had worn boots not their own. Someone had copied footprints to point a finger. And someone had known Lettice would go walking in the orchard that day. Rain, though it exposed, also washed things clean. But not entirely, because even the smallest detail, mud scraped on a window ledge, a print that mirrored too perfectly, could betray a truth long hidden. She looked down at her knitting, where a single dropped stitch waited quietly to be noticed, corrected. There you are, she said to it, smiling. You always show yourselves in the end. Chapter 6. Lace glove, crimson stain. A delicate clue emerges from a hat box in the attic, elegant, unmistakable, and soaked with implications. The attic at Greystone Manor had always held a certain reverence among the staff, a place not merely for moth-eaten trunks and faded upholstery, but for the private remnants of the past. Boxes of forgotten invitations, parcels wrapped in brown string, and handwritten labels, trunks that creaked when opened, filled with war uniforms and christening gowns. It was the sort of place where the air was thick with lavender sachets and the ghosts of former seasons, and where the floorboards groaned with the secrets they were tired of keeping. It was Mrs. Danforth, the housekeeper, who first uncovered the hat box. She had gone up that morning with Mabel to find old lace table runners for the harvest supper, muttering about the state of the linen cupboard as she dusted off a collection of valises lined with striped ticking. The hat box was tucked beneath a sewing basket and an ancient croquet set, the once white ribbon now grey with age. Inside, nestled among tissue paper, was a single lace glove, ivory, finely woven, clearly expensive, and delicate as spun sugar. And across the palm, unmistakably, was a dark brown-red stain. Blood. Mrs. Danforth went quite pale. She closed the lid with trembling hands and sent Mabel down to ring Inspector Graves at once. Miss Marple, who had taken her customary seat in the tea-room by the window that morning, heard about the discovery no more than 20 minutes later, brought in by way of Mrs. Finch's loose-lipped cousin, who had delivered a basket of marrow chutney and left with far more than she'd come for. Up in the attic, no less, Mrs. Finch relayed breathlessly, stirring her tea without tasting it. Blood on it, they say, and lace. Lettice did wear lace, didn't she, for the fete last year? Miss Marple offered only a thoughtful nod, her expression unreadable. She took her time finishing her tea, paid for her currant scone, and made her way quietly to Greystone Manor, where Inspector Graves was already taking statements. The glove had been removed to his case, but Miss Marple asked very politely if she might be allowed to look at the attic for herself. It's often the setting, she said mildly, that tells us more than the object. Graves, by now long resigned to Miss Marple's curious but infallible ways, consented with a weary nod. The attic, reached by a steep, narrow staircase behind the servants' corridor, was dimly lit by a dormer window and carried the scent of damp timber and old dust. Miss Marple stepped carefully, her eyes scanning every corner, every edge of furniture, every rug or trunk that might hide something placed rather than forgotten. "There," she said quietly, pointing to a wardrobe near the chimney breast. "May I?" Graves opened it. Inside hung two coats, one a moth-eaten wool greatcoat, the other a woman's traveling cloak in dark blue velvet. The hem was stiff with dust, and the sleeves had been sewn in with new lining. Miss Marple reached for the sleeve, her fingers tracing the stitching. "This has been done recently," she murmured. "See here, the thread still holds dye. Whoever last wore this cloak wanted to alter the shape. Slimmer arms, perhaps?" Graves raised an eyebrow. "You think the glove belongs to the wearer?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that the glove was planted. But not here, not originally. This attic was not meant to be part of the scene. No, it was desperation, or fear, that brought it up here. Someone wanted the glove hidden, and this cloak may have once hidden them." Graves was about to reply when Mabel appeared at the top of the stairs, face flushed. "Begging pardon, sir, but Lady Theodosia's just rung for the gardener. Says she wants the rose arch cut back, says it's obstructing the view of the orchard. But she's never cared for the rose." Arch Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Ah," she said softly. "Now that is interesting." It was late in the day when Miss Marple returned to the village, walking slowly, her thoughts as carefully arranged as her knitting bag. In the parlor of her cottage, she sat down with her journal, where she had begun to jot a list of curious facts. Lettice Blackwood had owned a pair of lace gloves given to her by her grandmother, embroidered with her initials, though the glove found bore no monogram. Lady Theodosia had feigned ignorance of any such gloves when asked last week. Miss Felicity Arkwright had attended the midsummer fete, wearing lace gloves that she borrowed from Lady Theodosia's cedar chest, so she claimed. The blood-stained glove had been found in a box with a ribbon matching Lady Theodosia's hatbox collection, a web of connections, each thread delicate like the glove itself, but leading unmistakably to a single point. By Wednesday morning, Miss Marple had requested a quiet meeting with Inspector Graves in his office, where she laid out her findings with the precision of a seasoned gardener pruning away dead branches. "The glove," she began, "was not Lettice's, nor was it left at the scene. It was, in fact, kept by someone who believed it might one day become useful, as a lever, a threat, a shield." Graves frowned. "A shield?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Someone else was there, at the scene of the crime. Someone who did not kill Lettice, but found the body shortly after, and in panic, perhaps, or confusion, left behind the glove. When they realized the danger, they retrieved it, hid it. But then, as suspicion began to turn on them, they planted it somewhere it might be discovered, with just enough ambiguity to draw attention elsewhere." "Lady Theodosia," Graves said slowly, "she found the rose arch inconvenient. The attic is hers, and she has the habit of tying hat boxes with identical ribbon." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Indeed, but it wasn't Lady Theodosia." Graves blinked. No, it was Miss Arkwright." There was a long silence. "She had access," Miss Marple continued, "to the cedar chest, to the attic, to the garden. She idolized Lady Theodosia, you see, and she feared Lettice. Lettice had threatened to expose her, an indiscretion, I believe, involving a forged signature on the trust's accounts. She hadn't meant to kill her, of that I'm quite certain, but when she found Lettice, already dead, she panicked. She took the glove she'd dropped, thinking it might be used against her, and later attempted to direct suspicion away towards Lady Theodosia, who had been growing distrustful of her, poetic in its way. Graves exhaled slowly. She confessed? She will, Miss Marple said, rising gently. People always do, in the end, especially when faced with someone who knows what they did with the other glove. Graves gave her a long, appraising look. You've already found it, haven't you? Miss Marple gave the mildest of smiles. In the cloak, sewn into the sleeve lining, a very old trick. My cousin Millicent did the same with toffee wrappers during chapel. Outside, the rain began to fall again, softly this time, like an afterthought. In the distance, the roses bowed once more beneath the weight of water, and in the heart of Little Witchford, secrets continued to unspool, petal by petal, stitch by stitch, beneath the watchful eye of Miss Marple. Chapter 7. Secrets at the Fête Pavilion. At the village fête, laughter masks suspicion. A whispered exchange behind bunting tells a different story. The fête day dawned bright and blue-skied, with only a light breeze to rustle the bunting that fluttered from one end of Little Witchford's green to the other. The scent of fresh scones, cut grass, and rose-petal jam hung thick in the air, and the cricket pitch, for once, had been commandeered by the WI's trestle tables, a coconut shy, and the pavilion, now transformed with streamers, lace-edged tablecloths, and an extraordinary number of vases holding hydrangeas in varying shades of blue and lavender. Children darted past with toffee apples and jammed fingers, and Colonel Weatherby, in his threadbare regimental jacket, stood guard by the tombola like a lion before a very unimpressive gate. Mrs. Calthorpe's Victoria sponge had already won the baking prize, and Reverend Hale's sermon beneath the gazebo had been graciously brief if somewhat distracted. Miss Marple sat near the pavilion steps, beneath a cream parasol, her fingers moving steadily over her knitting. She had a plain brown tea cake on her saucer and a cup of Earl Grey, which had long since cooled, but her eyes moved continuously, never impolitely, but keenly, from group to group, from expression to gesture, taking in the village tableau as one might read the third act of a familiar play. It had been 2 weeks since the death of Lettice Blackwood, and though much had been discussed, and much more whispered, the matter remained unresolved. The village, like a field of well-mown grass, had smoothed itself neatly over the gash, yet beneath the surface, the roots of unease were still tangled and alive. The pavilion was the centerpiece of the fete, decorated with charming excess by Miss Arkwright and Mabel, the maid from Greystone Manor, who had taken surprising charge of bunting and flower arrangements with what Miss Marple noted as the enthusiasm of a guilty conscience or a girl in love. It was behind the pavilion's gauzy bunting, among the crates of lemonade bottles and extra teacups, that something unexpected occurred. Miss Marple had observed it without appearing to watch, a hurried exchange between Dr. Linton and Miss Arkwright. He had approached from the south end of the green, taking care to circle the coconut shy and avoid the main crowds. She had appeared moments later from the pavilion's side door, cheeks flushed and hands twisting in her gloves. They spoke in low, urgent tones, Miss Arkwright looking up sharply, Dr. Linton glancing over his shoulder more than once. Then, just before they parted, she pressed a small object into his palm, a folded note or something of similar size. Miss Marple, behind her parasol, counted precisely 8 seconds between the transfer and Dr. Linton's brisk departure. By mid-afternoon, the fete had reached its most boisterous phase. Ribbons were askew. Children were stickily overfed. and even the colonel had been coaxed into bobbing for apples with uncharacteristic joviality. Yet Miss Marple remained pensive. It was not the presence of secrets that troubled her. Secrets were as much a part of English village life as jam and Jerusalem, but the direction in which they pointed. And today, all signs, it seemed, pointed back to the pavilion. Later, when the bunting had begun to droop and the plates had been cleared, Miss Marple made her way discreetly around to the side of the pavilion. She knew, as most did not, that it had a small rear door, used in earlier times for deliveries and inconvenient clergy, and that it led into a narrow passage where spare decorations and fete supplies were kept. She did not expect to find anything so soon. Inside the half-shadowed corridor, upon a crate marked "Summer Punch Glasses," lay an envelope. It had not been tucked away, merely left, perhaps discarded in haste or as a misdirection. Miss Marple picked it up, turned it over. No name, just one word, in clear feminine handwriting: Ledger. Her pulse, while never rash, quickened slightly. Carefully she opened it. Inside was a torn piece of parchment, quite old, bearing the remnants of a legal letterhead and the words "Codicil, amends the original trust, left in entirety to Miss Lettice Blackwood. Override Clause 7. Witness J. Blackwood." Miss Marple exhaled slowly, her mouth a thin line. So it was true. Lettice had not only found the original will, but had evidence, concrete and damning, that would unravel the careful balance of inheritance at Greystone Manor. Someone had stolen it back, but not to destroy it, to hide it. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned calmly to find Dr. Linton, his coat unbuttoned, his expression unreadable. "Miss Marple," he said softly, "I didn't expect—" "No," she interrupted gently. "You didn't." There was a long pause. The late sunlight filtered through, the bunting above casting soft pink and blue shadows across the floorboards. "She gave it to you," Miss Marple said, "or tried to, at the fete today, but she'd already passed it to someone else before that. Someone she trusted more than herself. Someone like Mabel." He didn't deny it. "She was afraid," he said quietly, "afraid of what it would mean. She told me she didn't trust her own family. She said, 'If anything happens to me, find the ledger.'" "And you thought to find it first," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "to spare someone, or perhaps to protect yourself." "I didn't kill her," he said, not quite looking at her. "No," Miss Marple said, "but I believe you know who did." He was silent. "I also believe," she added, "that you've been afraid of them far longer than you'd like to admit." He met her eyes then, and something in his expression softened. Defeat. Or perhaps relief. "She came to me with that letter a week before she died," he said. "She asked me to verify the legal phrasing, said she found it among her grandfather's belongings in the attic, but I never saw the full document, just enough to know what it meant. And then," Miss Marple said, "someone else found out she had it. I didn't know who," he said, "but she mentioned a confrontation with Miss Arkwright. Said she was prying around the family accounts." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. And I dare say she thought Lettice would hand everything over in a suspicion it seemed were not so very different. Both, when observed carefully enough, revealed far more than they concealed, and behind every ribboned arch there was always a whisper waiting to be heard." Chapter 8. The Portrait Over the Fireplace. Old eyes in oil paint seem to watch as the detective puts the pieces together and notices what's missing. The drawing room at Greystone Manor was the very image of ancestral pride, dimly lit with heavy damask curtains, a Persian rug slightly worn at the edges, and bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes that hadn't been opened in decades. It had the faint smell of polished walnut and old smoke, the kind that lingers in houses where fires have been lit out of habit more than need. And above the hearth, commanding the room as surely as the man it depicted once had, hung the portrait of Admiral Septimus Blackwood. The Admiral, rendered in oil with military precision, stared sternly into the room as though perpetually disapproving of the modern habits of his descendants. His gaze followed you, no matter where you stood, and the effect had always been unsettling. Even Miss Marple, who was rarely rattled, could not help but glance upward when she crossed the threshold. She sat now, in a brocade armchair with a cup of tea untouched in her lap, while Lady Theodosia stood nearby, arms folded, the curve of her mouth too firm to be mistaken for warmth. "You wish to speak with me, Miss Marple?" the lady said, not without a note of impatience. "I do hope we can avoid further speculation. This household has had quite enough of that." "I quite agree," said Miss Marple gently, "which is why I thought it best to speak plainly." She paused, knitting set neatly in her bag, hands folded with deliberate calm. "You see, I've been thinking a great deal about Lettice, about why someone might have wanted her silenced, not out of sudden passion, but calculation, because she had stumbled upon something meant to stay buried." Lady Theodosia's expression did not change, but her fingers curled slightly into her sleeve. Miss Marple went on, "We've spoken of the codicil, of the ledger, and the trust, but what struck me, you see, was not what Lettice found, but where she found it." She looked up, her gaze settling on the fireplace. "In the attic, you said, among old trunks and papers. But I have a theory," Miss Marple continued, her tone as mild as if discussing an unfortunate marmalade recipe, "that the codicil was originally hidden here, in this very room." Lady Theodosia arched a brow. "In this room?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, rising with quiet grace. She crossed to the fireplace and looked up at the Admiral's portrait. "Behind the painting, to be exact. It's a very old trick. My Uncle Henry hid his racing slips behind the family portrait of Queen Mary. Paintings like this often hinge out from the wall, did you know?" "I hardly think—" But Miss Marple had already reached up, her small hand moving delicately along the frame. With a soft click, the portrait swung forward on a concealed hinge, revealing the cavity behind. It was now empty, only faint dust outlines, marked where something rectangular had once lain. Lady Theodosia made a sound halfway between a gasp and a denial. "I'm afraid the ledger is no longer there," Miss Marple said, "but it was, until recently." "That's absurd. I never—" "Perhaps not you," said Miss Marple gently, "but someone close to you, someone with access, someone who believed Lettice was about to betray them. Miss Arkwright, perhaps, or your son." Lady Theodosia turned away abruptly. Miss Marple's voice remained low. "There's more, I think. You see, Lettice didn't simply die by chance. She was lured to the orchard, where the path curves out of sight, where sound doesn't carry. The gardener found her," Lady Theodosia whispered. "But the gardener didn't call for help. Mabel did. That too is interesting. I suspect Mabel knew more than she dared say, and I believe she saw someone that day. Someone placing something behind the portrait, someone with blood on their glove." At last, Lady Theodosia turned back, her face pale. But it was not guilt Miss Marple saw. It was fear. "It wasn't Jonathan," she said, You mustn't think that. He's weak, yes, but he isn't cruel. Not like—" She stopped. "Not like whom, Lady Theodosia?" There was a long silence. "I didn't know until afterward," she said quietly. "I found the glove, the real one. Not the one planted in the attic. The other. It was hidden behind the portrait. He meant to burn it, I think. But he was called away." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Dr. Linton," Lady Theodosia flinched. "He was Lettice's confidant, but he was also ambitious. He'd invested foolishly abroad. He asked for her help. She refused." "She was planning to expose him," Miss Marple said. "Yes. And he feared," she added softly, "not only disgrace, but prison." The old woman closed her eyes. "He told me it was an accident, that she'd stumbled and struck her head. But there was too much blood, far too much. And when I found the glove, his glove, the one she snatched as he struggled, I knew." Miss Marple stepped forward and took her hand. "You protected him." "He's the only family I have left," Lady Theodosia whispered, "and I thought the scandal would kill what little remains of this house." "It's already dead," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "Truth is the only thing that lives." Later that evening, as Inspector Graves was summoned and statements were made, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer in the drawing-room, gazing once more at the Admiral's portrait. "Very clever of you," she murmured. "Not to speak, but to see." The painted eyes seemed to stare on, unblinking, unsmiling, bearing witness to yet another secret dragged at last into the light. And outside, beyond the leaded panes and the dying garden, the village exhaled once more, quiet, orderly, and watching, just as she always had. Chapter 9. Midnight at Ravenscroft Hall. Candles flicker, doors creak, and someone moves through the corridors where no one should be walking. Ravenscroft Hall, a brooding Georgian pile just beyond the village of Little Witchford, had stood in elegant decay for generations. Its tall sash windows stared blankly across the wind-raked lawns, and ivy, unchecked for the past 20 years, had made a quiet conquest of the southern facade. The hall had once been the pride of the Blackwood family before the trustees, the lost fortune, and the war had reduced it to a relic maintained by pride more than means. Now it echoed. Every footstep, every shift of timber, every creak of its ancient bones spoke of the past. And on certain nights like this one, Ravenscroft whispered, Miss Marple arrived by invitation, though not by the lady of the house. It was Jonathan Blackwood who had sent the note, written with uncharacteristic urgency, and slipped beneath her door that morning. Come after nightfall. There is something you should see, and I must speak freely. She had arrived just after 10:30, greeted not by a footman, none remained, but by Jonathan himself, hollow-eyed, tight-lipped, and pale beneath his moustache. The hall was dimly lit, the power unreliable, and so he guided her through the drawing-room by candlelight. They did not speak much at first. She took in the old portraits lining the stairwell, the threadbare Persian runner, curling at the edges, and the smell, old wax, damp stone, and the faintest hint of tobacco. He led her to a small sitting room on the second floor, once used as a study. There, on the desk, lay a small, leather-bound book, the ledger. I found it behind the false panel in the library, he said. The one Father used to hide the port. Miss Marple nodded. I rather suspected it would turn up. I didn't kill her, he said abruptly. I argued with her, yes. But I thought she was being foolish, dramatic. She said she wanted to make everything right. I told her she was naive. You were afraid, Miss Marple said gently. Yes, he admitted, because I didn't know what else she'd found. They both turned at the sound of a creak above them. Jonathan stiffened. No one else is here, he whispered. Lady Theodosia is staying at the vicarage until morning. I thought it best. Another sound, a slow step, soft but certain, in the corridor. Miss Marple rose at once, taking the candle. Stay here. He looked at her, astonished. You can't go wandering this house alone at midnight. But she only smiled. My dear Mr. Blackwood, I have walked the corridors of truth far longer than these hallways. She moved quietly, the candle casting tall, shifting shadows along the panelled walls. The corridor curved gently past shuttered windows, and the wind tapped faintly at the glass. Another footstep, closer now, a door ajar. She paused at the west gallery, where the guest rooms once lay. The door to the blue room stood half open. She pushed it gently. Inside, a figure moved swiftly, startled perhaps, but not panicked. Miss Marple stepped into the room, raising her candle. Miss Arkwright, she said softly. Felicity Arkwright stood beside a writing desk, a small bundle clutched in her hands. Papers. The light caught her eyes, wide, tear-filled, but not ashamed. She began. Miss Marple stepped closer. Looking for something? Or perhaps removing it? Felicity's lips parted, but she said nothing. I suspected you might come back, Miss Marple continued. You see, guilt rarely sits still. It moves, it searches, it returns. I didn't mean to hurt her, Felicity said suddenly, her voice trembling. I only meant to frighten her, just enough to make her keep quiet. She threatened to expose you, Miss Marple said. She would have. She said I falsified the accounts, just a few figures to make the books balance. I meant to pay it back. I've done everything for this family, everything. Miss Marple looked down at the papers in her hands. And you thought, if the ledger vanished, she wouldn't be believed. And when she died, when she was killed, I thought, Felicity crumpled. It was him. Dr. Linton, I saw him go into the orchard that night. I thought it was him. Miss Marple nodded slowly. He was there, but he found her too late. He panicked. He told no one. Felicity stared at her. Then who? The answer came in a whisper, a shuffle behind them. Miss Marple turned. In the doorway stood Mabel, the maid. Her face was white. Her apron was askew. I didn't mean to, she said softly. Miss Lettuce, she told me I'd be dismissed. Said she'd tell Lady Theodosia everything. About me and Thomas. About the money I took. Felicity's voice was barely a breath. Mabel. She said I didn't belong here, Mabel whispered. Said people like me didn't belong in houses like this. I only meant to stop her speaking. The room was very quiet. Miss Marple lowered the candle to a nearby table. And when it was done, you took the glove from her hand, hid it, and waited. Mabel nodded once, then fell silent. It was over. Later, when the inspector had arrived, and statements were taken, and Mabel had been led quietly down the grand staircase and out into the cold night, Miss Marple remained by the fireplace, in the small study. Jonathan had gone to fetch his mother, and the hall was still once more. She looked again at the ledger on the desk, then up at the portrait of Septimus Blackwood, glowering in guilt. So many sins, she murmured, begin with silence. The candle flickered once, then went out. Chapter 10. The truth beneath the floorboards. In a final reveal worthy of the greats, silence gives way to confession, and the village exhales at last. The parlour of Miss Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead was warm with the scent of lemon verbena and old wood polish. Outside, the last leaves of October skittered along the lane in golden flurries, and the lace curtains trembled gently in the draught. Inside, the ticking of the mantel clock was the only sound. It was 3 minutes to 4. Miss Marple, seated in her high-backed armchair, set down her knitting and folded her hands in her lap. The teapot sat patiently on the table, 2 cups prepared. Right on the hour, a firm rap came at the door. "Do come in, Inspector," Miss Marple called, without rising. Inspector Graves entered, hat in hand, the weight of the week behind him. He looked older than usual, lines drawn deeper at the corners of his mouth. Miss Marple gestured to the chair opposite. "I imagine you've had a rather difficult morning," she said gently. He exhaled. Miss Arkwright's confession was complete, if not entirely coherent. The forged accounts, the glove, the misdirection. She admitted to hiding the ledger to protect herself and, though it's hardly a legal justification, to preserve Lady Theodosia's reputation. "And Mabel?" Graves shook his head. "She's quiet now, hollowed out, like a house left too long with the windows shut. It was Lettuce's threat, as you said, the fear of exposure, the desperation. She's confessed." Miss Marple poured the tea with steady hands. "Such things are rarely the product of a single moment, Inspector. They begin with the tiniest compromise, a small theft, a lie told to protect someone else, or oneself. And slowly, the floor beneath one's feet begins to shift." Graves accepted the cup, but didn't drink. His gaze rested on the fire, the flames flickering low. "She was so young," he said finally. "Miss Blackwood?" "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but not foolish. She was brave, and that often frightens people more than they care to admit." There was a pause, filled with the subtle clink of china and the muffled cawing of rooks outside. "It's the floorboards," she said suddenly. Graves turned to her. "Pardon?" "The ones beneath the staircase landing at Greystone," she said. "They creaked slightly too often for a house so old to remain unaware. It struck me that someone had been lifting them, perhaps often. I dare say Mabel discovered the hiding place long before she confessed." Graves frowned. "You think she kept something there?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. Not just the glove, or the bloodied handkerchief, which was never found, but the original ledger, the full one. I believe the one recovered earlier was a partial document." Redacted. Graves stood. "Then we must—" "There's no need," she interrupted kindly. "I've already retrieved it." He blinked. "I asked Godfrey the under-butler for access this morning. I told him I was seeking the Admiral's portrait again, which wasn't entirely untrue." From beside her chair, she withdrew a modest leather-bound volume, its edges slightly frayed. She passed it to him. Graves opened it, leafed through a few pages, and exhaled. "Everything," he murmured. "The amended codicil, the ledger entries, and the proof of the forgery." Miss Marple gave a nod, small and dignified. Lettuce was not simply being dramatic. She was seeking justice, however clumsily. She had trusted the wrong people, but her instinct was right. Graves said nothing for a long time. Then he looked up. "I still don't understand how you saw it, Miss Marple. How you knew." Miss Marple smiled. "Human nature, Inspector. It never truly changes. You see, I once knew a young parlour maid who broke into the silver drawer at my cousin Millicent's house. We were all certain the culprit had been an itinerant handyman, but I noticed the parlor maid was constantly sweeping the same patch of carpet day after day. It was only later we discovered she'd hidden the brooch beneath a loose floorboard, out of guilt, I think, or perhaps in hope she might return it. She sipped her tea. Mabel did the same. She feared discovery, yes, but she feared her conscience more. So she left a trail, a hesitant, frightened trail, and someone had to follow it. Graves leaned back, shaking his head with quiet admiration. "You should have worn a badge, Miss Marple." "Oh, goodness no," she said briskly. "I should far rather remain in my garden with my roses and lemon balm. But I do believe, in some cases, a potting trowel and a good ear are all one needs." That evening, as twilight fell over St. Mary Mead and chimneys began to curl smoke into the brisk autumn sky, the village exhaled. The news spread quietly. Mabel arrested, Miss Arkwright charged, the Blackwood estate to be reviewed. The tea-room was unusually subdued. Even Colonel Weatherby lowered his voice. And while some tutted and others nodded grimly with the satisfaction of the just, a few looked more reflective, as if reminded that even ivy-covered cottages held doors best left unopened. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her knitting. She had dropped precisely one stitch in the course of the week, and now, with the matter settled, she resumed her work with careful ease. Outside, the wind rattled the garden gate, but inside, all was still. The floorboards creaked once, then fell silent.